What happens to a country when the war arrives without warning shots and leaves without apologies? What does it feel like to wake up in your own bed and realize you're no longer free? It begins without fire, without sirens, without even a proper goodbye. On one morning in June 1940, life in France turned inside out. The German army rolled into Paris not with a roar, but with a hum. Tank engines echoing off the cobblestones, boots tapping in sync, silence stretching between street corners like barbed wire no one could see. For those who lived through it, it didn't feel like a battle. It felt like the air had changed. As the French government collapsed and the armistice was signed, a new reality was quietly layered on top of the old one. Same streets, same church bells, same cafes. But now the menus were missing items and the faces were missing smiles. The swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. German road signs replaced French ones. Soldiers in gray-green uniforms leaned against the walls of corner bakeries, watching, always watching. At first, people stared. Then they stopped. The word occupation doesn't capture the strange blend of normalcy and fear that seeped into every home. Radios began to vanish. Jewish neighbors went silent. Posters went up in shop windows, not in French but in German, and said very little except who now controlled what. Schools still opened. The post still ran. Children still played. But the rhythm of life had changed. Now there were curfews, ration cards, censorship boards. A line outside the butcher might stretch for an hour just for scraps of horse meat. Coffee became roasted chicory. Bread became thinner. Everything became quieter. Newspapers arrived each morning, filled with propaganda and omissions. What wasn't said was louder than what was. Resistance at first wasn't heroic. It was emotional. It was private. It was not standing when the German national anthem played on the radio. It was looking away. It was hiding a book. People began to whisper again about the government in exile, about Churchill, about hope. But whispers could cost you everything. In small towns, a rumor could be more dangerous than a bullet. In cities, eyes followed you everywhere, from shopkeepers who suddenly knew too much, to strangers who lingered too long beside your door. French civilians quickly learned how to survive a regime that didn't speak their language but understood control. There was no war raging in the streets of every village, but there was war inside the soul of every citizen. Each day brought choices. Do you trade your extra cigarettes for meat? Do you keep the old radio knowing it could get you arrested? Do you help the woman you've seen followed 3 times this week? Or do you pretend not to see it all? Occupation is not just a military term. It's a psychological one. It presses in slowly, changing how you speak, how you move, how you even think. By the end of 1940, over 2 million French soldiers were prisoners of war. The government had fled south to Vichy. But for those left behind in the north, the occupied zone, each day became a performance. Smile at the soldier, nod at the new inspector, keep your head down, don't talk politics. And yet, under the silence, people began to map invisible lines of resistance. Women carried coded messages in baskets of bread. Children watched train schedules for anomalies. Priests passed information in confession. Housewives ran underground newspapers from behind kitchen walls. The danger was constant. The Gestapo made arrests without warning. People disappeared. Sometimes entire families. Sometimes just a coat left hanging on a chair. But even under that pressure, French civilians found ways to keep a small part of their spirit untouched. Some wrote letters that would never be sent. Some kept journals they knew would be found. Some just sang old songs quietly after dark, because no one could take the words from them. The line between bravery and survival blurred. Was it cowardice to say nothing when your neighbor was taken? Was it resistance to hold on to old books, banned songs, memories? These were not questions answered in grand speeches or dramatic moments. They were answered alone, often in the dark, in silence, over and over, for years. And yet what the German occupation couldn't erase was the quiet defiance found in the smallest things: a stolen radio signal, a meal shared in secret, a poem remembered. France was not defeated, it was waiting. And beneath every act of compliance was the hope that one day the soldiers would leave, the signs would come down, and the children could walk to school without seeing rifles. That hope, that simple human desire to be left alone to live, was what carried millions of civilians through the heaviest years of their lives. Not because they were fearless, but because they were human, and they refused to forget what freedom felt like. You might think that occupation means soldiers with rifles shouting in the streets or barbed wire coiled through neighborhoods like vines, but for most civilians it was far more subtle and far more unsettling. It was the feeling that your own country was watching you from behind foreign eyes. At first glance, much of France looked unchanged. Buildings still stood, markets still opened, bells still rang in church towers. But the feeling in the air, that was different. Something quiet had settled in, like a blanket made of tension. In cities like Paris, Lyon, and Lille, German officers moved into grand hotels and requisitioned apartments, sometimes politely, often not. Some families were forced to vacate their homes within 24 hours, their belongings left behind or hastily thrown into suitcases. Those who remained in their homes sometimes found themselves living below a German garrison, listening through the ceiling to boots, voices, and laughter they couldn't understand. But the more terrifying changes were the ones that didn't make noise. One morning, you might wake up and see a notice posted at the boulangerie. New identification rules, new business closures, a list of names crossed out under the title, "Suspected Collaboration with the Enemy." Another day, you'd hear whispers that someone's son had been taken. No trial, no explanation, just taken. And people learned to stop asking why. The rhythm of daily life changed in strange ways. Shops began to close earlier, not only because of curfew, but because supplies ran thin. Meat was rationed. Butter became a luxury. People reused tea leaves and invented recipes from root vegetables they never would have touched before. Even soap became precious. In towns, lines formed outside stores before dawn, people clutching ration books, hoping for eggs or bread, or perhaps just the comfort of standing with others who understood the waiting. For children, the world narrowed. Schools remained open, but curriculum changed. Maps were updated. Textbooks were censored. Some Jewish students disappeared, one by one, their desks left empty with no explanation. Teachers who asked too many questions were reassigned or simply vanished. Students were warned not to speak at home about what was said in class. It wasn't just the government that changed. Language itself began to fracture. A new vocabulary emerged, shaped by fear. Collaborateur, résistant, milice, déporté. These words were whispered in hallways and behind doors, always with caution, always with the sense that if you used them too loudly, you might be next. The radio, once a window to the world, became a dangerous possession. German-approved stations filled the airwaves with propaganda and military marches, while banned broadcasts from the BBC became the lifeline of the underground. Families would huddle in darkened rooms late at night, tuning the dials slowly, holding their breath when they heard an English voice crackling through the static. It wasn't entertainment, it was a reminder that the outside world still existed, that the war was not over, and that someone, somewhere, was still fighting. But even listening was illegal. Being caught with an unauthorized radio could mean arrest, imprisonment, even deportation. So many hid their radios in walls, under floorboards, inside mattresses. Every time they listened, they risked everything, not for information, but for hope. And yet, even under this strain, life went on. People got married, children were born, birthdays were celebrated with recycled paper and dried fruit. Women still put on lipstick when they could find it. Men still gathered in cafes, though now their conversations were shorter, their laughs quieter. To be seen smiling too much could be suspicious. To be seen frowning could be worse. Everyone learned to live between expressions, and in that space, a new kind of courage grew. Not loud, not dramatic, but slow and unrelenting. Some civilians began helping in small ways. A hidden loaf of bread delivered at night. A warning slipped under a door. A child escorted safely from one city to another. The line between ordinary and resistor blurred. The grocer who saved a little sugar for a Jewish family. The priest who baptized children under false names. The librarian who let someone borrow a book that had been banned. These were not the acts of spies or soldiers. These were the acts of neighbors, of people who still believed in the softness of right and wrong, even when the world demanded hard choices. But with each act came risk, and with each risk came a consequence. The Germans and their French collaborators had eyes everywhere. The Gestapo worked hand in hand with the milice, the French paramilitary force loyal to the Vichy regime. Dressed in civilian clothes, they moved through towns unnoticed, listening, watching, compiling names. They infiltrated resistance groups, posed as sympathizers, lured people into traps. Some did it for ideology, others for money, others simply to survive. One letter, one overheard conversation, one wrong word at the wrong time, and you could be taken, not arrested, taken. Because that was the difference. You weren't always accused. There was no defense, no trial, just a knock on the door at dawn. And after that, silence. Your house would remain, your dishes left on the table, your cat waiting by the window, but you were gone. And still people resisted, quietly, carefully, because for many doing nothing was the greater crime. And for those who couldn't act, who couldn't speak, even the act of remembering, of refusing to forget the people who disappeared, became its own rebellion. France under occupation was not a single story. It was thousands of parallel lives, intersecting only in fear and longing. It was a grandmother baking without butter, a boy with a secret in his shoe, a wife with a coded name in her address book. It was not about heroism, it was about endurance, about the quiet strength of staying kind when cruelty was expected, about the aching decision to hope when hope was not offered. And through it all, the question hung in the air like the blackouts at night. How much longer could this last? Would the Allies come? Would the war end? Would things ever return to how they were? No one knew. But in the meantime, French civilians kept moving forward, one ration, one whisper, one day at a time. Imagine the rhythm of your life being rearranged by an invisible hand. Imagine your neighborhood clock chiming the same way it always has, but this time it's reminding you not that dinner is soon, but that the curfew is minutes away. And being late by even one step could mean your name goes on a list. Not a loud list, not a shouted one, just a quiet entry in a folder that never forgets. In occupied France, time itself changed meaning. Once 9 p.m. meant cafes alive with talk, street lamps glowing on cobblestones, couples walking slowly past shuttered bookshops. After occupation, 9 p.m. meant shadows rushing indoors, windows going dark, a long silence settling across rooftops like a second skin. Civilians learned to shape their days around absence. Absence of sound, of certainty, of control. The days were shorter now, not because of the sun, but because you had fewer safe hours to move, to speak, to exist, without risk. Workplaces opened early. Errands were done quickly, and always your eyes scanned the edges of streets for checkpoints, patrols, uniforms. The German soldiers weren't always violent. That was what made it worse. Some were polite, some bought flowers, some even smiled, but every smile carried a question. What happens when someone with power pretends to be gentle? And worse, what if they weren't pretending? French civilians didn't know which was more dangerous, the soldiers who looked away or the ones who didn't. In this world, uncertainty was the most common emotion. You could wake up one morning to find the bakery open and the bread fresh. The next day, the baker was gone and the shop windows smashed. You could walk past a soldier who ignored you one week and have your bag searched by him the next. The randomness bred quiet panic. People learned not to plan too far ahead. They stopped writing things down. Calendars weren't hopeful anymore. They were warnings. Which day is the market open? Which day is the meat delivery? Which day might I disappear? And underneath all this structure was a deeper layer of complexity, the human one. What do you do when your neighbor suddenly has more food than everyone else? What do you do when he starts hosting German guests? When his daughter begins walking arm in arm with a man in uniform? Collaboration wasn't always clear. Sometimes it came dressed as survival, other times it came with perfume and silk gloves. Civilians wrestled with this new moral math. A friend who once helped carry your groceries might now write names for the milice. A grocer who once gave you a ration of butter might now whisper about your family to passing patrols. But how can you accuse someone when you don't even trust yourself to speak freely? So, you remain quiet. And you hope. And the city slowly becomes a maze of half-truths. In cafes, menus shrank. Coffee was a memory. People drank blackened water with a hint of roasted acorns. Sugar cubes became treasures. Butter was worth favors. Meat was counted in grams. Even wine, so foundational to French identity, began to vanish from shelves, stored in basements, traded in whispers. And through it all, people adapted. They shared recipes. They cut their bread thinner. They rationed everything: food, words, warmth. Mothers learned to make soups from roots and peels. Fathers learned to sew. Children learned not to ask where the neighbors went. And when the sirens sounded, whether for Allied planes overhead or for something else entirely, everyone moved as one. Down into cellars, into courtyards, beneath stairwells. The air would tense, lights would flicker, silence would fall. And then, when the danger passed, the silence would remain, because it had become a habit, an instinct, a form of defense. Churches remained open, but even they changed. Sermons grew vaguer, confessions became heavier. Priests were approached by members of both sides, some seeking forgiveness, others seeking information. The church had to navigate its own maze of resistance and survival. Some priests helped the underground, others informed, and most just tried to keep their parishioners alive. Weddings still happened. Baptisms still happened. But joy was muted, wrapped in worry, always held at arm's length. The underground resistance, at first, was scattered. Small groups with typewriters, pamphlets, contacts in the countryside. Some worked alone, some with networks. They hid in libraries, in schools, in farmhouses, and civilians became their lifeblood. A woman might carry a coded message in her knitting. A boy might deliver a note sewn into his bicycle seat. A pharmacist might substitute a poison for a placebo if the right person asked. These weren't acts of war, they were acts of identity, of refusing to let go of France, even if the flag no longer flew. But for most civilians, resistance wasn't active. It was internal. A quiet refusal to forget who you were. A decision, each day, not to give in fully, not to normalize the boots on your street, even if they walked there every day. It was setting an extra plate for someone who might need a hiding place. It was giving your child a storybook when the world no longer made sense. It was reminding yourself as you walked past a German checkpoint that your silence did not mean agreement. It meant endurance. And the longer the occupation dragged on, the more endurance was needed. By 1942, deportations intensified. Entire families were rounded up: Jews, Roma, foreigners, resistors. The Veldhiv roundup in Paris became a horror etched into memory. Thousands held in a stadium. No food, no water, no answer, only trains. And then, nothing. Civilians heard rumors. They saw the empty apartments. They saw the furniture moved out. But the government didn't speak. The newspapers didn't explain. And fear did the rest. Families started sleeping in shifts. People began carrying identity papers wherever they went. And young men, especially, began disappearing into the forests, into the resistance, or into hiding. For civilians, the world became two layers, the visible and the hidden, and they had to live in both at once. Through it all, life continued. Because it had to. You still had to dress, you still had to wash, you still had to look normal. But the definition of normal had changed. Now it meant keeping your voice even, keeping your shoes clean, keeping your secrets safer than your money. It meant waking up each morning, knowing the rules might have changed again. It meant saying goodnight to your family, knowing that tomorrow might bring questions you couldn't answer. And so the French people endured, with quiet strength, with silent hope, with the knowledge that history was happening around them, but that survival itself was a kind of resistance. If you were a mother in occupied France, every morning began with a mental inventory. How much flour is left? Are the ration tickets still dry? Did my child cough last night? And if so, can I find medicine for it? But deeper than those daily calculations was a more haunting list you didn't write down. Who saw me at the market yesterday? Did the neighbors hear the BBC broadcast through the wall? Is it still safe to let the boy bike alone? Civilian life under occupation wasn't marked by battles, but by background noise, an endless undercurrent of risk pulsing just beneath ordinary tasks. And for women, especially, the pressure was unbearable and unspoken. Many men had been taken as prisoners of war, or had disappeared into forced labor camps, leaving households to be run entirely by wives, daughters, and grandmothers. A woman might have 3 children to feed, a grandmother to care for, and not a single safe conversation left in her village. They became caretakers of not only their families, but of secrets. The kind of secrets that weighed more than suitcases. At the same time, their roles shifted under the occupation. Some were asked to work as translators for the Germans. Some were offered extra food in exchange for company, conversations, dinners, or something more. These women weren't villains. They were hungry. They were scared. And some of them were 17. In the towns and cities, there was no clear moral compass anymore. Everything depended on who was watching. You could smile at a German officer and be called a traitor. You could spit at him and be arrested. You could do nothing and still be suspected. In this impossible moral fog, women learned to survive with instinct, calculation, and silence. Many joined the resistance, not as fighters, but as messengers, as forgers, as lifelines. They carried coded notes in their knitting baskets. They passed instructions to strangers at train stations. They memorized safe house addresses like hymns. The Germans often underestimated women. They saw them as domestic, distracted, incapable of espionage. That mistake became one of the resistance's greatest weapons. A woman with a baby carriage could pass through a checkpoint without a second glance. A school teacher with a satchel could carry 2 sets of documents, one real, one false, and walk directly into enemy offices to deliver a report. These small acts saved lives. They didn't look heroic, but they were. Outside of the resistance, mothers faced quieter crises. Children didn't always understand what was happening. They saw soldiers, yes, they heard the planes, but they also just wanted sweets. They wanted to play, and parents had to create a world where joy was still possible. Imagine explaining to a 6-year-old why their best friend can't come to school anymore, why they have to say goodbye to the radio, why they can't sing the old songs anymore. Some families kept their children indoors for weeks, not because of curfews, but because there had been a raid down the street and the air felt cursed. Others disguised fear as play. When air raid sirens rang, children were told it was a game, a race to the basement. When butter ran out, mashed turnips were called fairy cakes. Parents knew that shielding children from the truth would only last so long. But they also knew that in war, imagination was a kind of shield, and sometimes pretending things were normal was the only way to survive the abnormal. In rural France, things were different, but no less tense. Farmers became smugglers, shepherds became guides. Whole villages learned to speak in code. The land was both a prison and a hiding place. Forests hid partisans, barns concealed fugitives. In the countryside, people could disappear more easily, but they could also be found more easily. The Germans conducted random house searches, interrogations, and field inspections. You might be asked why you have more chickens than your ration sheet allows, or why your barn smells of tobacco when you're not a smoker, and the wrong answer could cost you everything. Still, rural communities often became the backbone of the underground resistance. They fed the networks, they moved the messages, and when the time came, they hid the hunted. Sometimes Jews, sometimes Allied pilots, sometimes French escapees. And in these moments, villagers who had never left their province suddenly found themselves standing between life and death, not with guns, but with silence. One of the most dangerous tools of survival was the black market. Officially banned, quietly essential. If you had something to trade, wine, soap, jewelry, you could get what you needed. But black markets weren't just alleyway exchanges in cities. They were informal economies that spanned entire regions. A man might ride 2 towns over to sell eggs in exchange for fuel. A woman might sew clothes in exchange for cheese. And yes, sometimes morality was exchanged too. The line between necessity and exploitation blurred constantly. Some civilians had no choice. Others saw opportunity, and everywhere there were eyes. Collaborators were not always obvious. They were not all evil. Some were poor, some were frightened, some simply believed the propaganda. But all of them added to the pressure. Their reports could lead to arrests. Their silence could be bought. Their loyalty was rarely predictable. So civilians became actors. They smiled in public. They rationed their words. They learned to live between suspicion and routine. Imagine cooking a meal, knowing that the knock at your door might not be your neighbor but a patrol. Imagine tucking your children into bed, knowing that if the wrong person says the wrong thing, your family might be torn apart by morning. And yet, through it all, people adapted. They held weddings with no music. They baptized babies under false names. They buried the dead with no priest, because even grief had rules now. The French people, known for protest, for loud dinners, for expressive emotion, learned to speak with their eyes, their hands, their habits. Resistance wasn't just sabotage or espionage, it was maintaining dignity. It was keeping culture alive. In secret basements, people gathered to read banned poetry. In attics, artists continued to paint what they saw, truths that could not be spoken. In kitchens, families passed down recipes for dishes they could no longer make, so the memory of flavor would survive even if the ingredients did not. This was occupation, the quiet erasure of freedom, and the louder refusal to forget what it once tasted like. And for every moment of despair, there was also resilience. A joke told in the dark, a child's laughter echoing off stone walls, a letter passed through 3 hands before reaching the resistance. Small miracles born of steady courage. These weren't grand gestures, but they were the reason France remained France, even when her voice was forced to whisper. Not all tragedies in wartime arrive with thunder. Some arrive on quiet mornings with paper and ink. For many civilians in Nazi-occupied France, terror didn't announce itself with the roar of planes or the crack of rifles. It slipped through mail slots and was signed by someone who never saw your face. Summons, decrees, notices. The administrative machinery of occupation was brutal in its coldness. It turned fear into bureaucracy. A knock on the door and a man in civilian clothing handed you an envelope. You didn't argue. You opened it in silence. You stared at a line that said you were to report to the Kommandantur at 8 o'clock the next morning. No explanation, no defense. And from that moment, your home became a waiting room for dread. Were you being conscripted, questioned, accused? Would you return? In thousands of homes across France, people sat at their kitchen tables reading letters that made their hearts race and their hands go numb. Others didn't receive a letter at all, just a phone call, a whispered tip, or a neighbor's sudden change of tone. But the effect was always the same. Something invisible had touched your life, and it might never let go. For young men especially, the fear of being taken to Germany under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, mandatory labor service, hung over their heads like a shadow no light could dispel. Starting in 1942, French workers were rounded up and sent east, not to fight but to build, to become part of the vast economic engine that fed the Nazi war machine. Factories, railroads, mines. Some families never saw their sons again. Others received letters, brief, censored, carefully composed. I am well, I am working. But the gaps between those lines spoke louder than the words, and for every letter that came, 3 did not. Families began to hide their sons. Basements became shelters, attics became bedrooms. Entire villages participated in the concealment. A young man might be working in the fields, but no one could remember which field. One day he might be a student, the next day he was visiting relatives far away. Mothers practiced the lies they would tell if the police arrived. Fathers taught their sons how to keep silent even when the questions grew sharp. And neighbors, real neighbors, became lifelines. 1 knock on the wall meant danger. 2 meant wait. 3 meant run. These codes weren't taught. They were passed down in glances, sharpened by repetition, made sacred by desperation. The deeper the occupation went, the more France became a nation of whispers. Even joy had to be edited. If someone smiled too much, people wondered why. If they laughed too freely, it raised questions. Civilians learned to mute their expressions, to speak in neutral tones, to temper every feeling. Weddings still happened, but the music was quiet, the gatherings small. Guests arrived not all at once, but in staggered steps. The bride wore a dress that had been borrowed, altered, worn before. The groom smiled only when the curtains were closed. But those smiles, muted though they were, meant something fierce. They meant defiance. They meant love still bloomed in soil laced with fear. Meanwhile, funerals posed another kind of risk. If the deceased was someone connected to the resistance, or a Jew, or a suspected dissident, the funeral could be watched, attended by uniformed strangers, photographed, recorded. Even mourning was now a performance. How long you wept, who you stood beside, which flowers you brought, any detail could be noted. So families buried their dead with trembling care, knowing that grief itself might implicate them. The very act of remembering someone could put the living in danger. But the greatest wound civilians endured wasn't always physical or political. It was the slow erosion of trust. In some towns, a neighbor you'd known since childhood might now wear a different face. They might report you, or they might protect you. You couldn't know until it was too late. The local butcher might slip a coded message into your bag, or he might be watching who buys too much. The man who fixed your bicycle might shelter a fugitive, or he might hand you over for a few francs. Every relationship became a tightrope. Even within families, cracks appeared. One brother might be a gendarme working for the Germans, the other hiding leaflets in his coat. One cousin joined the milice to feed her child. Another joined the maquis and never returned. These were not simple times, and there were no simple choices. Many people did what they had to, not out of cruelty, but out of calculation. What could you live with? What would keep your family safe? And above all, what would leave no trace? Because leaving no trace became the new form of safety. You didn't write down addresses, you didn't keep photographs, you didn't keep a diary unless you were willing to risk everything. Even the objects in your home were suspect. A British coin, a radio part, a foreign book. One item too many and you could be questioned, so people cleaned their lives of anything dangerous, not just physically, but emotionally. They told themselves not to miss the past, not to hope for too much, not to feel too deeply, and yet they still did. Letters from the front were read and reread until the paper faded. Photographs were hidden in floorboards or behind loose bricks. A child's toy might be all that remained of someone lost, but it was kept, wrapped in cloth, passed quietly from one hand to another. Because memory, even when painful, was a kind of rebellion. And some civilians didn't hide their resistance. Some stared it in the face. Women shaved their heads and took oaths. Men carried explosives under their jackets. Teenagers rode trains across the country with forged documents and beating hearts. But they were the exception. Most civilians resisted with gestures so small they went unnoticed, except by the ones who needed the most. A nod at a checkpoint, a door left unlocked, a loaf of bread wrapped in silence. These were not grand acts, but they were in many ways more powerful than sabotage, because they proved that even under the boot of occupation, humanity still moved through the cracks. It still passed between hands, behind curtains, beneath fear. And that is what civilians clung to. Not just survival, not just endurance, but the idea that one day someone would remember them, not just for what they suffered, but for how they stayed human in a time designed to destroy that very thing. If you woke up in occupied France and the streets were quieter than usual, it didn't bring peace. It brought questions. Where was the baker's cart? Why hadn't the milkman come? Why were the shutters closed on houses that were usually open? Civilians became skilled at reading absences. They noticed when curtains didn't move, when someone failed to collect their ration, when a child didn't appear on the doorstep before school. These weren't coincidences. They were signals. In a world where direct information had become both rare and dangerous, silence was often louder than any report. But not all absences were permanent. Sometimes they meant someone was hiding, nearby, in a shed, a crawl space, beneath the loose boards of a bedroom floor. And hiding someone was not a dramatic act in the way the movies might suggest. It wasn't always a moment of shouting and knocking and sudden decisions. Often, it was slow. It started with a glance, then a question, then a terrible moment of mutual understanding. A knock at the back door. A trembling voice asking, "Just for tonight?" And then, without a word, you opened the door. You cleared the cellar. You laid down blankets, and you hoped the people who passed on the street would keep walking. Many civilians didn't plan to be heroes. They weren't part of any network. They weren't soldiers in disguise. They were shopkeepers, teachers, carpenters. But in a war like this, the line between civilian and fighter was made of paper, and one signature could tear it apart. You could be a school teacher by day and a message courier by night. You could be a dressmaker who hid ammunition inside folded fabric. You could be a child who carried notes written in lemon juice that only appeared under heat. Resistance wasn't always visible, but its consequences were. If a hidden radio was found, the entire family might disappear. If a barn was searched and revealed more than animals, it might be burned to the ground. And yet, people still hid, still helped, still said yes to that quiet knock in the dark. The decision to help someone, to risk everything, was often made in seconds, but its weight remained forever. Families who had never spoken a word of politics suddenly became guardians of fugitives. They learned to live with fear as a house guest. Meals were halved, beds were shared, windows were watched more closely, and children were taught not to ask questions. In these homes, the sound of footsteps above meant more than a creaky board. It meant life or death, because betrayal could come from anywhere. It might be a neighbor, it might be a cousin, it might be a child who repeated something overheard. And so, silence became the most reliable safety net. In some towns, rumors traveled faster than trains. Someone was arrested in the next village. Someone else confessed. A priest disappeared. A name was dropped. And even if the rumors weren't true, they shaped reality. People avoided each other not out of cruelty, but out of defense. A shared coffee became a liability. A conversation over the fence became a risk. The very idea of connection, of closeness, was transformed into a gamble. And that gamble often felt too steep, especially when the consequences could arrive without warning. Civilians learned that fear doesn't always shout. It often whispers. It appears in the way someone looks at your front door, in how long a car idles outside your home, in the sudden quiet after a knock. And if fear whispered, violence didn't always announce itself either. It could come softly, with gloves, with papers, with a calm voice asking, "Is this your address?" And then everything changed. Families were separated before they understood why. Children were taken in the night, and entire households disappeared from one sunrise to the next. No warning, no explanation, just vanished. Civilians who remained learned to keep a second bag packed, a small one. Bread, a shirt, some coins, perhaps a photo. Not because they were planning to leave, but because they knew they might not get to plan. And for those who stayed, who managed to endure, their survival came with guilt. Why them? Why not the neighbor? Why not the friend who once brought them apples during rationing? The survivors' questions were the same across France, echoing through cities and farmlands, through kitchens and alleys. And no one had answers, only memories. And memories didn't always comfort. Some memories haunted, some twisted over time. Some were buried deep, because remembering them too clearly meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. In churches, civilians prayed, but not always for victory. Often, they prayed for clarity, for the strength to endure another week without news, for the people who had vanished, for the people they couldn't help, for the shame they carried for staying silent, for the rage they couldn't express, and for something even more elusive, hope, because hope had become a dangerous thing. It could lift your chest just enough to make the next disappointment fall harder. It could make you leave a light on, waiting for someone who would never return. It could make you listen for rumors about a landing, a revolt, a change, only to find out that it was nothing. Again. Still, civilians hoped. Even when it hurt, they painted stars on ceilings for children who hadn't seen the sky. They wrote letters they never mailed. They hummed songs from before the war, hoping the notes might carry some piece of peace back into the walls of their homes. They lit candles, not always for faith, but for memory, for light in a time of shadows. In some villages, entire communities would gather after curfew, not in defiance, but in mourning. Quiet walks, no talking, just movement. As if the act of walking together in silence could somehow remind them that they were still a people. Still French, still human. These moments weren't written about in newspapers. They weren't recorded by the occupying forces. But they happened. They mattered. They were the quiet rebellion of endurance. And perhaps most haunting of all was how quickly people adapted. A generation grew up not knowing anything else. Children learned to tell time by checkpoints. Teenagers learned to fake documents before they learned to drive. And families celebrated holidays without heat, without gifts, without even the names of their missing loved ones. But they celebrated anyway. Because to stop celebrating would mean letting go of something even more essential than bread or butter. It would mean surrendering the memory of what life used to be and the belief that it might someday return. So civilians clung to fragments, a recipe, a bedtime story, a scarf passed down. These small things became anchors, and in a world that no longer made sense, they reminded people of something that still did. That dignity was worth preserving. That courage wasn't always loud. That history wasn't only made by armies and generals, but also by mothers who whispered lullabies in basements, by children who drew pictures of homes they hadn't seen in years, by fathers who traded the last of their rations to protect someone else's son, and by the millions of civilians who refused in 1,000 quiet ways to let their humanity be stolen by uniforms, decrees, or fear. When the Allies first began dropping leaflets over occupied France, they weren't bombs. They were promises printed in black ink on paper thin enough to flutter between cobblestones. For civilians, these fragile messages didn't bring food or warmth, but they brought something else: confirmation that the outside world still existed. That somewhere beyond the checkpoints and curfews, there were voices speaking French without fear. The leaflets came suddenly, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes after nightfall, sometimes drifting down during market hours, as if the sky itself had changed sides. They spoke of resistance, of sabotage, of hope. They warned of German defeats, of Allied landings, of coming liberation. But most importantly, they reminded civilians that their suffering was seen. The occupation had made many feel forgotten, like shadows beneath the boots of history, stuck in a war they hadn't declared and couldn't escape. But now, paper from the sky told them they weren't alone. Children chased the fluttering sheets like snowflakes, only to have mothers pull them back. "Not now," they whispered. "Not here." Because even hope, if seen in the wrong hands, could become evidence. Keeping a leaflet was dangerous. Reading it aloud was worse. Sharing it could get you killed. And yet, copies were memorized, recopied, passed hand to hand in kitchens and schoolyards and train compartments. Each one was a secret with wings, and civilians carried them like prayers. But not every paper that arrived came from friends. The German administration flooded the streets with their own posters, pamphlets, and proclamations. Town squares were layered in decrees, lists of new curfews, forbidden radios, required identifications, punishable offenses. Each week, the posters changed. The text grew tighter, the ink more threatening. Names appeared, sometimes entire lists, people arrested. people executed. The names weren't always known, but civilians read them anyway, scanned them, paused on them. Because sometimes you found the name of someone you once bought eggs from, or someone who once helped carry your daughter's bicycle up a muddy hill. Seeing a familiar name in black ink changed you. It made you look over your shoulder differently, made you walk faster or slower, made you stop smiling in public altogether. And yet, some still found ways to smile, quietly, cautiously, because resilience wasn't loud now, it was studied. It was layered beneath ritual. Families continued to celebrate birthdays, not with gifts, but with presents, not with parties, but with quiet meals and handwritten cards that said little and meant everything. A father might carve a whistle from scrap wood. A mother might fold a paper crown from an old ration card. These weren't gestures of joy, they were gestures of defiance. Even in a world where sugar was contraband and cake was a memory, candles still flickered. Because civilians knew that some things couldn't be outlawed. Light, laughter, memory, and even beneath the pressure of survival, they held on to the idea of togetherness. In cities like Lyon and Marseille, families crammed into single rooms after their homes were seized or destroyed. 3 generations under one leaking roof. Grandparents on makeshift beds, infants swaddled in curtains, entire apartments redefined to fit whatever safety remained. And despite everything, meals were still made. Soup from potato peelings, bread from chestnut flour, stew from roots and rationed meat. Every bite was a negotiation, every spoonful was a ceremony, and every mealtime was a test of what could be stretched, substituted, disguised, but also what could be shared. Neighbors leaned on each other. When one family had salt, another had oil. When one had butter, another had news. It wasn't always fair, and it wasn't always friendly, but it was survival. In the countryside, things were no less desperate. Farmers were forced to give up livestock, grain, wine, all requisitioned by the occupiers, often without payment. Tractors were stolen, oxen killed, orchards pillaged. The resistance of the land was slow and silent. Some farmers lied about their harvest. Some buried food in dry wells or hollow trees. Some slaughtered animals secretly at night, dividing the meat between those who wouldn't talk. It was a dangerous game. Inspectors came often. They measured grain sacks, they counted cows, they sniffed cellars. A missing chicken could lead to an arrest. And yet, in barns and root cellars across France, the truth was hidden beneath hay and stone and silence. Because even when the fields were stripped, the soil still held secrets. Civilians, whether urban or rural, learned to listen, not just for the sound of sirens or boots, but for the subtle music of resistance, a bicycle bell in the wrong pattern, a knock at a bakery window, a candle lit in a window after curfew. These weren't accidents, they were codes, language without words. In some towns, someone whistling a certain tune meant the Germans were nearby. In others, it meant it was safe to move. Children were taught these codes without explanation. They simply knew when to nod, when to stay quiet, when to run. It became muscle memory, an instinct embedded deeper than fear. And through this web of quiet signals, the resistance moved. Not in capes, not in parades, but in ordinary bodies, through ordinary lives, performing extraordinary calculations every single day. And as the war dragged on and rumors of Allied invasions began to swirl louder than the planes above, civilians started to hope again, but differently, cautiously, exhaustedly. Not the hope of victory, but the hope of survival, of ending, of waking up to a day where you didn't have to hide your radio or count your words or pray your last envelope wouldn't be your last breath. Some didn't live to see that day. Others lived just long enough. And many, when it finally came, couldn't believe it. Because when you've survived years of quiet horror, the sound of freedom can feel disorienting. It doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives with a pause in gunfire, a stranger hugging you in the street, a flag, suddenly no longer forbidden, flying from your neighbor's window. Liberation didn't erase what civilians had endured. It didn't undo the betrayals or bring back the disappeared. But it did prove something, that the human spirit, bruised and bent though it was, had refused to break. And in the faces of those who had whispered their way through years of silence, there was now something louder than victory. There was remembrance, and that would last longer than any anthem. Even after the Germans left, not all shadows vanished. For civilians in France, liberation did not arrive like a sudden sunrise. It crept in slowly, unevenly, and sometimes painfully. The sound of retreating boots was often followed by silence. And that silence could be just as frightening, because in the vacuum left behind, something else began to surface. Memory. Memory sharp as a knife. Memory full of guilt and questions. Not everyone had resisted. Not everyone had suffered equally. And when the swastikas were torn down and tricolor flags returned to balconies, a new kind of reckoning began. What had your neighbor done during the occupation? What did your cousin say to the Gestapo? Who had signed that letter? Who had remained silent when silence felt like betrayal? In Paris, people gathered in cafes once shuttered by war, sipping wine again. But now, every conversation held a second layer. Names were whispered. Accusations slipped between jokes. Some of the laughter felt forced, brittle, like it belonged to people trying to forget something they knew would never leave them. In villages, the reckoning was less elegant. Hair was shaved. Walls were painted with the word traitor. Women accused of collaboration, whether true or imagined, were dragged into public squares, their children crying, their faces humiliated by their own neighbors. Men who had worked with German officials found themselves isolated or hunted, not through official courts at first, but through the law of street justice. And justice, in those first weeks, had no patience for detail. There were reprisals, there were mistakes, there were private scores settled under the flag of patriotism. The same street that had stayed quiet during the darkest years suddenly roared with judgment. And for many, this roar came too late. Some collaborators had already fled, others had changed their names, others stood among the crowd, pointing at someone else. The line between guilt and innocence blurred, and in that blur, the civilian mind struggled to hold itself together. What did it mean to survive? Was survival itself a kind of compromise? What about those who had stayed quiet just to protect their families? Were they cowards or careful? The war had ended, but the war inside each person had only just begun. For the children who had grown up under occupation, peace was a foreign country. They had known the world through whispers and hunger. Their earliest memories weren't of toys, but of ration lines, checkpoints, radio static. Now, as peacetime resumed, they watched adults cry for reasons they didn't understand. They saw their schools reopen with missing desks. Their teachers looked older, thinner. Some students never came back at all. No one explained why. And those absences hung in the air like second shadows. In the countryside, fields had to be reclaimed, not just from weeds, but from silence. Some land had gone untouched for years. Mines had been buried. Forests had been used as hiding places or battlegrounds. Civilians returned to these places cautiously, digging, clearing, hoping not to find bones, or worse, unexploded promises of violence. Farmers tried to coax life back from soil that had forgotten the sound of laughter, and in many cases it worked, slowly, painfully, but not without scars. Cities, too, had to recover, not just from damage, but from disbelief. How do you rebuild a bakery next to a building that once housed collaborators. How do you open your shutters knowing the woman across the street reported her own brother? How do you marry when your fiancé's father never came back from the camp? These weren't questions governments could answer. These were questions that lived in the bones of survivors. And as daily life resumed, markets, newspapers, buses, debates, the civilians of France had to learn a strange new language. A language of cautious truth. People didn't always speak openly about what they had seen. They didn't talk about the beatings, the betrayal, the quiet suicides, the hunger that made them steal, the moments when they closed the door instead of helping. These memories didn't fit neatly into the story of liberation. They were too messy, too human. And so, many civilians buried them, but they didn't disappear. They lingered in diaries, locked in drawers, in old photographs no one displayed, in letters never sent, in habits that remained long after the uniforms disappeared, like eating in silence, keeping the windows closed, avoiding certain names. Even joy felt suspicious at first. Music sounded too loud. Dancing felt indecent. And yet, civilians danced. They laughed. They fell in love again. But underneath every celebration, there was a tremor. A knowledge that the ground could shift again. That safety, once taken for granted, was now something fragile, something earned and protected and never fully trusted. And so the next generation grew up under the shadow of stories half told. Their parents didn't always explain. They spoke in fragments and gestures and warnings that didn't make sense. Don't ask too much. Be careful who you talk to. Lock the door, even in daylight. And so children learned, even in peace, to carry a kind of invisible armor. Some became historians, other artists. Others kept their heads down, building quiet lives from the ruins of a time they could never fully understand. But all of them inherited a silence that wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that had never been spoken aloud. Over the years, monuments were built. Names were carved into stone, museums opened, school children were taught dates, battles, treaties. But for the civilians who had lived it, the war wasn't about maps or speeches. It was about the morning they went without bread, the night they didn't sleep, the friend who never knocked again, the sound of footsteps on stairs that made their heart freeze. These weren't facts, they were ghosts. And those ghosts walked beside them long after the guns had gone quiet. And maybe that is what history often forgets. That while battles are fought in days, civilian wars are fought in years, in memories, in rituals, in silence. The war for France's civilians didn't end on any official date. It ended slowly, in kitchens, in funerals, in the stories that were finally told, or the ones that were never told at all. Liberation, for them, was not a parade. It was a process, a painful, necessary, unfinished process, and maybe it still is. In the years that followed the war, France tried to stitch itself back together, institutionally, architecturally, emotionally. The streets were patched, the rationing slowly lifted, and the schools reopened with teachers who no longer feared surveillance. But beneath the scaffolding and cement, under the surface of parliaments and parades, the civilian memory of occupation remained raw. You could see it in how people paused when the power flickered, in how some still kept spare candles tucked inside drawers, not for ambiance, but for safety, and in how certain doors stayed locked, not out of necessity, but habit, a gesture taught by trauma. Survivors didn't speak of these things openly. It wasn't done. There was a quiet agreement among many to focus on progress, on growth, on the new world being born out of rubble. But history doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable. It lingers in the cracks. And in France, those cracks widened every time a new generation began to ask questions. What had happened in their towns? Who had helped? Who had harmed? And what exactly had their own families done? For many, these questions were dangerous, not because they were false, but because they were true. Families discovered letters hidden in old trunks, photographs with unfamiliar faces, ration cards stamped with the emblem of the occupier. Some found uniforms, others found the names of the dead etched into church walls they had passed 100 times. The truth, when it came, didn't arrive gently. It arrived in fragments, and each fragment changed everything. For those who had resisted, the post-war years were sometimes bittersweet. They had survived, but their comrades had not. They were hailed as heroes, but felt like ghosts. Some refused medals, others refused interviews because what they remembered wasn't always victory. It was the sound of shoes in the dark, the smell of fire in barns, the last words of someone they couldn't save. It was the knowing that survival had come at a price, and the price had names. The resistance, as remembered by books and film, was daring, noble, cinematic. But for the civilians who had lived it, it was also messy, terrifying, and riddled with moral compromises. Not everyone who resisted wore an armband. Some just opened a door, passed a message, gave a ride. And not every act of resistance looked heroic. Sometimes it was feeding someone the state called illegal. Sometimes it was not reporting a neighbor's silence. Sometimes it was simply not breaking when you were threatened to. And then there were the others, the ones who had cooperated. For food, for protection, for ideology. After the war, they were publicly condemned, shamed, sometimes executed, but not all were caught, and some, even years later, remained quiet, living ordinary lives in towns they had once betrayed. Their children, in many cases, had no idea, because shame doesn't write itself into family trees. It hides in silence, in gaps between generations. But the silence didn't always last. By the 1950s and 60s, a new France had emerged, economically booming, culturally vibrant, politically complicated. And with that new France came a new kind of memory. Films began to question the myths. Journalists dug into archives. Survivors began to speak. Not all of them, and not always easily. But slowly, stories returned. Stories of mothers who hid strangers in flower cellars, of children who watched from behind curtains as soldiers took away neighbors, of priests who forged documents in the sacristy, of farmers who buried resistance fighters without crosses. These stories didn't always fit the national narrative, but they were true, and they mattered, because they gave texture to history. They reminded France and the world that occupation wasn't just about soldiers and leaders. It was about the woman who used her bread ration to feed a fugitive, about the man who rode his bicycle 20 miles to deliver a whispered name, about the child who learned not to speak above a whisper because danger was always listening. Civilians had lived in a world where every action echoed, where the smallest decision could tip a life toward survival or death. And those kinds of decisions don't just vanish when the guns go silent. They stay. In memories, in dreams, in the way someone stirs their coffee too long, thinking of a name they haven't said aloud in decades, in the way they hesitate before telling a story that starts with, "back then." Because back then isn't just a time, it's a world. A world where morality was a moving target, where there were no guarantees of justice, where doing the right thing didn't always end well. And yet, civilians kept trying. They tried to live with their choices, to raise children without passing on fear, to build new lives without erasing what came before. It wasn't always successful. Some passed on their silence, others passed on their stories. Some buried everything. Others wrote it down in notebooks that wouldn't be opened until after their death. And each choice, each silence, each testimony became part of the larger mosaic of what it meant to survive the occupation. And even today, if you walk the streets of certain French towns, you might see brass plaques on the sidewalk, small, square, and easy to miss. They list names, dates, locations of arrest. They mark the homes of Jews who were taken, resistance fighters who vanished, children who never came back from school. They're called Stolperstein, stumbling stones. Their purpose is simple: to make you stop, to remind you, to make you look down and see a name where a person once lived. And that, in many ways, is what the memory of civilian life under occupation truly is. Not a sweeping narrative, but a stumble, a pause, a recognition. That history is not something that happened elsewhere. It happened here, in this street, in this house, in this family. And the people who lived it weren't heroes or villains. They were people, with fear, with flaws, with choices that no one should ever have to make. And those choices still echo, not just in France, but in every country that has ever endured occupation. Because the lessons of that time about silence, courage, morality, and survival are not confined to the past. They are still relevant, still urgent, still whispering beneath the surface of modern life. And maybe, if we keep listening, we can hear them not just as warnings, but as reminders of what humanity looks like in its most fragile and most resilient form. There's something deeply haunting about ordinary people being forced to live in extraordinary times. In Nazi-occupied France, civilians weren't just living through a war. They were navigating a daily maze of moral landmines where survival often depended on silence, luck, or choices that could never be spoken of again. For many, the occupation wasn't a single moment of horror. It was a slow, grinding erosion of normalcy, where danger didn't always come with warning signs, and trust became a rare and fragile currency. One of the hardest things for civilians to reconcile after the war was just how much of their lives had been shaped by uncertainty. Imagine walking to the bakery, unsure if the woman behind the counter was passing information to the Germans. Imagine giving a neighbor a loaf of bread, only to wonder days later whether she was part of the resistance or working with the Gestapo. Every gesture, every smile, every delay in greeting someone could feel loaded with suspicion. And yet, in that fog of fear, civilians still had to function. They had to go to work if they could find any. They had to keep their children fed. They had to remember how to behave as if they were not slowly being consumed from the inside out by the knowledge that no place, no person, and no promise was truly safe. Children born during the occupation entered a world shaped by scarcity, whispered warnings, and emotional restraint. Many of them didn't cry when they were told to stay silent. They had already learned that silence was safer. These were kids who learned to hide under tables, who knew that if the door knocked after dark, it was never good. Some of them watched their parents exchange glances during radio broadcasts. Others were sent to the countryside and never told why. Years later, many would recall vague images: a father looking out the window too long, a mother burning papers in the stove, a knock on the door that changed everything. And when these children became adults, they carried that formative unease into their own parenting, often without knowing why. The trauma of occupation didn't just belong to the generation that lived through it. It echoed forward. It shaped the silence of the next. In towns where once the German flag had flown, liberation didn't bring instant joy. It brought confusion, grief, and questions too large to answer. Streets that had been filled with soldiers and curfews were suddenly flooded with celebration. But beneath the music and the flag waving, there was a quiet inventory happening. Civilians were counting the cost. Who had been lost? Who had disappeared? who had changed, and perhaps most painful, who had benefited. Because in every occupied zone, there were those who had adapted, not just to survive, but to thrive. Businessmen who signed contracts with the Germans, politicians who collaborated to preserve their status, and yes, even artists and intellectuals who kept publishing, performing, entertaining, sometimes with a smile too easily offered to their occupiers. After the war, the reckoning was uneven. Some were jailed, others quietly exiled, a few were even executed. But many escaped accountability. The fog of war was convenient for those who wished to disappear into it. And for the civilians who had suffered in silence, this uneven justice was bitter. It raised difficult truths about class, influence, and the uncomfortable reality that not everyone who suffered did so equally, and not everyone who collaborated paid a price. In the years that followed, the French government tried to rewrite the story into something cleaner. Charles de Gaulle declared that France had been a nation of resistors, that the true France had never collaborated, that the Vichy regime was an aberration. It was a powerful story. It gave the country pride, identity, dignity. But it wasn't entirely true. And civilians knew that, because they remembered. They remembered the neighbor who had joined the milice, the paramilitary force that hunted Jews and resistors. They remembered the schoolteacher who suddenly disappeared, the Jewish family down the street whose apartment was taken by someone else. These were not stories that fit neatly into national mythology, and so for years they lived in the margins, unspoken, unresolved, real. For the elderly women who had survived the occupation, the trauma took strange shapes. Some of them never again felt comfortable walking after dark. Others compulsively preserved food, hiding jars and tins in cupboards they didn't open for decades. Some refused to speak German ever again. Others secretly kept letters from a German soldier they had loved or feared, or both. One woman, a baker's wife in Normandy, reportedly never entered her own basement again after 1943. No one in her family ever asked why. They didn't need to. The past was buried, but it pulsed beneath the floorboards. For many civilians, especially women, the war had forced them into roles they had never expected. With men at the front or dead, women ran farms, shops, homes. They forged documents, carried messages, kept children alive. And after the war, many of them were expected to quietly return to their pre-war roles: homemaker, wife, mother. But something had shifted. These women had tasted independence born from necessity. They had learned to navigate terror with poise. And though few spoke of it aloud, they carried that strength with them forever. In some ways, they were the invisible architects of survival, never decorated, rarely acknowledged, but essential to the nation's endurance. The idea of civilian heroism is complicated. It doesn't wear medals. It doesn't have clean timelines or simple victories. It exists in the gray spaces between compromise and courage, between fear and action. A civilian who hit a neighbor was heroic. A civilian who said nothing when the neighbor was taken. Were they a coward? Or just a parent trying to protect their own children? History doesn't offer easy answers. But in Nazi-occupied France, thousands of people made decisions like that every day. And they had to live with those decisions for the rest of their lives. Some found peace, others never did. And in that uncertainty lies the true legacy of civilian life under occupation. Not a story of clarity, but a story of complexity, a story still unfolding. What do you do when survival feels like betrayal? For many civilians in Nazi-occupied France, that question didn't come with a dramatic soundtrack or grand courtroom trial. It arrived slowly, over years, in the form of quiet guilt. You were told to keep your head down. You didn't ask questions. You did what you needed to feed your children. But then the war ended and people started talking. Names were remembered, faces were scrutinized, and suddenly, the things you thought you had buried were no longer safe in silence. That's the truth many people never talk about, how shame operates after liberation. Not in public speeches, not in history books, but in kitchens and grocery lines, and glances between neighbors who used to wave without hesitation. When the uniforms vanished, when the flags were torn down, it wasn't just the landscape that had changed, it was the social contract. People had to figure out who they could trust all over again. Was your butcher really sympathetic to the Germans? Was your friend's uncle in the resistance or just a man with secrets and a radio? The lines were never as clear as the world wanted them to be. And so people improvised morality. They categorized others based on rumor, instinct, convenience. There were whispered lists of collaborators, though no one knew who started them. And there were people who suddenly became resistance heroes overnight, not because they had earned it, but because someone needed them to be. The war had been fought with bullets, but the aftermath was fought with memory. And memory, as any historian will tell you, is a slippery weapon. In some families, the occupation was never discussed again. Children would grow up with vague references to those years, or when things were difficult. Entire households existed as museums of omission. But occasionally, something would break the silence. A newspaper story, a name mentioned at a reunion, a question from a grandchild. And suddenly, the past would rush back in like cold air through a cracked door. In other homes, the past was never allowed to rest. Stories were repeated like rituals, becoming almost mythic. Your grandfather hid 3 Jewish children in the barn. Your aunt carried forged documents in her shoes. We risked everything for freedom. Maybe those stories were true. Maybe they were embellished. Maybe they were defense mechanisms or badges of pride. But either way, they shaped the next generation's understanding of what it meant to be French, not just in law, but in legacy. And yet, for every story of heroism, there were stories that remained unspoken. What about the family that took over the shop of a deported Jewish neighbor? What about the man who sold wine to German officers because it paid better? What about the woman who survived by accepting the protection of a soldier in exchange for silence? Or worse, affection. These weren't stories people told over dinner. These were stories buried in attics, stuffed in closets, locked behind facial expressions that froze the moment you asked too many questions. And still, those stories lived on. They seeped into habits, into silences, into the way certain people avoided certain streets. Because history doesn't just vanish, it changes shape. And in post-war France, it often took the form of quiet contradictions. Some of the loudest patriots had once been the most cautious. Some of the most celebrated survivors never spoke at all. And the children, watching all of this from the background, learned early on that truth was not always rewarded, and silence was sometimes the only language people trusted. In villages, these contradictions were even more pronounced. Everyone knew everyone, which meant everyone knew who had done what. And that knowledge could be corrosive. Some people left town, unable to live with the stairs. Others stayed, building new identities atop the ruins of old ones. A few committed suicide in the years after the war, not from guilt necessarily, but from the unbearable weight of being known. And still, life continued. Children were born, crops were planted, buildings were repaired, the war receded, but never fully disappeared. It was in the cracks of stone walls. It was in the way people counted calories even decades after rationing ended. It was in the heavy pause before someone spoke German on the street. And above all, it was in the way people remembered, or chose not to. Not all memory is linear. not all trauma announces itself. For many civilians, the war became a kind of background radiation, always present, never quite visible, but quietly shaping everything. Some tried to work through it by writing, others painted. Some became teachers, determined to pass on what they had witnessed. Others drank too much. Others simply endured. And in this quiet endurance, in this refusal to let their lives be solely defined by what they had suffered, there was a kind of courage that history rarely honors. Because it's not the kind that makes headlines. It's the kind that keeps a family together, that makes a meal stretch, that gets out of bed even when the world feels haunted. As the decades passed, the national conversation began to change. More books were written, more interviews recorded. Survivors began to testify not just about heroism, but about compromise, about the choices they regretted, about the people they failed to save. And in those admissions, something remarkable happened. A deeper kind of honesty emerged. Not the kind that builds statues, but the kind that builds empathy. The kind that says, I was there. I was afraid. I did what I thought was right. Sometimes I was wrong. And that, more than any speech or celebration, brought healing. Because it allowed people to be human again. Flawed, frightened, complex. Just like they had been during the war. And just like they still were. The occupation had tried to erase that humanity. But in surviving it, in remembering it truthfully, civilians reclaimed it. Not just for themselves, but for the generations still asking questions, still trying to understand, still trying to make peace with a past that never really ended. It just changed form. If you walk through certain villages in northern France, the ones where the streets are too narrow for modern trucks and the stone walls still carry the chill of the 1940s, you might stumble across something unexpected. Not a monument or museum, but a house with boarded windows, a barn with its roof caved in, or an overgrown path that leads nowhere. To a passerby, these might seem like remnants of rural neglect. But to the locals, they are something else entirely. They are the scars of the occupation, physical spaces frozen in time, untouched since the day someone disappeared, the day someone didn't come home, or the day a secret ended with a knock on the door. In some of these places, you can still find the initials carved into wooden beams, resistance members marking their meeting spots. You can still see bullet holes in walls, long since weathered but unmistakable. And if you happen to ask the right person at the right time, you might hear stories that haven't been told in decades. Stories about people who never returned, about radios hidden in wine cellars, about nights when every dog in the village seemed to bark at once and no one dared look outside. These are not the kind of stories you find in textbooks. They don't come with footnotes or headlines. They live in whispers. In the hesitant way, an old man gestures toward the forest and says, "That's where they took him." Or in the silence that follows when you ask about a building that clearly hasn't been lived in since 1942. These silences aren't empty. They are full of everything that was never resolved, full of guilt, of grief, of survival. Because one of the hardest truths of war, and especially occupation, is that not all endings come with closure. Some families never found out what happened to their loved ones. Some never knew who betrayed them, and others knew exactly who it was and lived beside them for years afterward. Imagine what that does to a community, to sit in church beside someone who once reported your cousin, to sell bread to a man whose father took part in arrests, to hear a child's laughter in a schoolyard and wonder if their grandparents were heroes or something else. This is the legacy that civilians carried after the guns fell silent. It wasn't just about rebuilding homes, it was about navigating memory, learning to live with contradictions. The same woman who once sewed uniforms for German officers might also have passed information to the resistance. The farmer who seemed to prosper during the war might have hidden fugitives in his hayloft. The boy who vanished from the village might have survived under another name, in another country, never returning out of fear or shame. The occupation didn't end neatly, and the people who survived it didn't always get to decide how they were remembered. In fact, many civilians feared being remembered at all, not because they had done something wrong, but because they had done something complicated. They had made choices no one should have to make. Choices between loyalty and safety, between morality and hunger, between silence and the lives of their children. And when peace returned, it didn't bring absolution. It brought more choices about what to admit, what to hide, what to tell the next generation. Some chose honesty, others chose silence, and both decisions came with their own kind of burden. Historians would later call this the gray zone of war, the space between collaboration and resistance. But for civilians, it wasn't a zone. It was a way of life, a daily negotiation with fear, 1,000 tiny decisions that added up to survival, or didn't. In interviews decades later, some survivors described the occupation as a dream they were never fully awake for. Others called it a prison without walls. One woman, a nurse in Paris, said the hardest part wasn't what she saw. It was what she didn't say. The moment she looked the other way when a boy was dragged off a tram. The day she pretended not to recognize a man being questioned. "I didn't do anything," she said quietly. And that's the part I remember most. For others, memory worked differently. They remembered the small victories, a warning given in time, a family smuggled through the woods, a German soldier who looked the other way just once and saved a life. These moments too became part of the civilian story, because even in the darkest circumstances there were flickers of light, and civilians clung to those flickers. They became proof that humanity had not been entirely extinguished, that choices still mattered, even if the world didn't notice, even if history never recorded them. The war ended, but the war within, the war of memory, identity, and moral reckoning, went on. And in that war, civilians had no medals, no ranks, no tidy endings, only the long, slow process of trying to make sense of the impossible. Some did it through art, others through silence. Some tried to forget, and some made it their mission to remember. And all of them, in their own way, became historians, not of events, but of experience, of what it meant to live when living came with a cost. That is what makes the story of civilian life in occupied France so powerful. Not the headlines, not the battles, but the everyday, the quiet, the fear, the kindness, the unbearable choices, the moments that didn't change the course of history, but that defined the lives of those who had to live through it. These moments are easy to miss. They don't make noise, but they shape everything. And if we listen closely, not just with our ears, but with our empathy, we might begin to understand what it truly means to survive a war you never chose, in a world that was never truly yours to control. And yet, decades later, the story still feels unfinished. That's the strange thing about history. It ends on paper, but not in people. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of southern France, there's still an elderly man who won't enter his attic because that's where his father hid the radio, the one that carried forbidden news from London. In the suburbs of Paris, a woman still skips the second verse of a lullaby because that's the one her mother used to hum when the soldiers were outside. In Lyon, a man walking past a bakery still glances at the basement window without meaning to. It's just something he does. And in all these places, in all these people, the occupation never fully left. It settled into their bones, into their reflexes, into the small details of their lives that no one else notices. These are not dramatized memories. These are the aftershocks of survival. For most civilians, the end of Nazi occupation was not a moment of triumph. It was a slow, messy, uncertain unfurling of possibility, shadowed by the weight of what had just passed. There were no clean slates, just blank pages stained with what could not be erased. For every family that celebrated a return, another family stood in front of an empty doorway, waiting for someone who would never come home. And that absence, that haunting quiet of a missing face at the table, became one of the most enduring marks of the war. It wasn't just the lives lost. It was the relationships interrupted, the questions unanswered, the futures that vanished without explanation. Some people waited decades for answers that never came, and others stopped asking because asking became its own kind of grief. For the French countryside, especially the villages, the war became part of the landscape. Abandoned rail tracks, overgrown with grass, cracked foundation stones where German checkpoints once stood, trees still growing around rusted nails where warning signs used to hang. Tourists might walk by and see history. Locals walk by and see memory. And in those places, there's a kind of reverence, not loud, not theatrical, but deeply rooted, as if the earth itself remembers. And maybe it does. But what about the civilians themselves? How do they remember all these years later? Some with pride, some with shame, most with a complex blend of both. A man might tell his grandson how he helped carry messages for the resistance, but he may never admit that in the beginning, he attended a few meetings of the Vichy youth group just to avoid suspicion. A woman might show her children the bicycle she rode through the forest to deliver bread to partisans. But she may not mention that she once gave directions to a German patrol, fearing what might happen if she didn't. These contradictions are not flaws. They are the truth of civilian life in a system that punished purity and rewarded performance, where moral clarity was a luxury few could afford. And yet so many still tried. They resisted in small ways, in gestures no one saw, in kindnesses that might have been fatal if discovered. They carried on, and that in itself was a kind of defiance. Because the goal of the occupation, like all totalitarian control, was not just obedience. It was internal collapse, to make people feel hopeless, paralyzed, powerless. Every act of humanity was an act of rebellion. Every decision to hold on to dignity, even silently, was a victory the regime would never record. But civilians recorded it, in diaries, in letters, in stories passed down carefully, sometimes secretly. And those records, scattered as they are, form the emotional archive of that era. Not the archive of what happened, but of what it felt like. And that archive is where the truth lives. Not the facts of dates and troop movements, but the fact that a mother once had to choose between hiding a stranger or keeping her baby safe. The fact that a boy saw his neighbor taken and never asked why. The fact that a priest once opened his door to a Jewish girl and never closed it again. These are the details that don't fit neatly into documentaries or textbooks, but they are the details that define a generation. Today, the world remembers D-Day, the resistance, the liberation of Paris. These are vital chapters in the story, but between them, around them, underneath them, is the quieter, deeper story of the people who lived with fear as a neighbor, uncertainty as a routine, and hope as a fragile, flickering thing. They were not soldiers. They were not generals. They were farmers, teachers, grocers, mothers, children. They were civilians, and they endured. As the last survivors of the occupation now slip into old age, their stories become even more precious. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are human. Because they show us what war looks like, not from the headlines, but from the windows of a darkened house. Not in strategy rooms, but in grocery lines. Not in explosions, but in whispers. The war is long over, but the lessons remain. That even in silence, there is resistance. That even in fear, there is courage. And that even in the most occupied spaces, a city, a house, a heart, the human spirit finds ways to remain free. So next time you pass an old French farmhouse with vines creeping up the stone, or a shuttered building in a quiet town square, ask yourself, what happened here? Who lived here? What decisions were made that changed everything? You may never know, but just by asking, you're keeping their memory alive. You're listening, and sometimes that's all history needs. Someone willing to listen in the dark, long after the noise has stopped. Someone like you,